My name is Rebecca Bernhardt. I am with Texas Physicians for Social Responsibility, and we are happy to have y'all here this evening. I want to introduce Dr. Punye Saberi, who is an assistant clinical professor at the University of Pennsylvania and an occupational and environmental medicine specialist, and also former board president of Physicians for Social Responsibility. And Dr. Folashade Afolabi, who is an assistant professor at UT Southwestern Medical School, a pediatric pulmonologist, and I don't know why I wrote this down, but attended Case Western Reserve for college, which I think surprised me. But anyway, let's get started.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Becky. So we're going to go ahead and get started today. And what we wanted to do was we thought that it might be a good thing to have a case presentation. That's typically how we, a lot of times we learn topics in medicine. But this time it's special because a volunteer from Texas PSR has offered us her story. And so what we're going to do is we're going to present parts of her story, and we're going to use that as a way to teach these key topics about air pollution. So you'll see us essentially, read out parts of this case. And so then you'll know that we're talking about, this particular person. We're going to start with childhood, then go into adulthood. Through that, we're going to touch on the connection between climate and air. We're going to end with environmental justice issues and some actions you can take. And we'll also kind of do a little bit of like honorable mentions of topics that we're not going to get into at this webinar, but they're just as equally important. We also wanted to say that we have no conflict of interest to this close. And with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Afolabi.
So in childhood, this PSR colleague grew up in San Luis Obispo on the central coast of California until high school, and lived in a rural neighborhood on the outskirts of town near a very small regional airport. Throughout their childhood, there were wildfires in and around the area, including some that started in the field behind their home. And in elementary school, one large, when they were in elementary school, and one so large, most of their city was at risk, that they missed because they were at summer camp. So they missed that fire. During high school, their family had to evacuate their home because of wildfires. Watching it come over the mountains was very impressive, but they were able to shortly return because the fire was contained. And then in their tweens, around 10 or 11 years old, they went to Los Angeles for a birthday party for an extended period of time, and had an uncontrollable cough and had to leave the classroom in elementary school because it was disrupting class, and would have to stand in the hallway having terrible trouble breathing, and didn't particularly recall coughing at other times, but certainly could have. They had their own room and played a lot outside. And at that time, they visited Los Angeles in 1982 or 83, and the city was notorious for having the worst air quality in the United States. And so what are some of the identified issues in this case presentation? If you can put that in the chat box, and feel free to take yourself off mute because it's a small group and you can answer it too. There were quite a few triggers. It sounds like we have a quiet audience, and that's okay. And so I think some of those triggered wildfires were definitely a trigger. And that significant pollution, air pollution in Los Angeles was a trigger, and that proximity to it, there was a proximity to an airport as well, right? And a proximity to an airport was probably a trigger as well. And there were probably some environmental, like allergen triggers in addition to that, definitely could have triggered difficulty breathing and asthma. Next slide. Now, present day, now that they are an adult, their 15-year-old daughter had recurrent respiratory illnesses as an infant and was diagnosed with asthma in elementary school. And she's been referred to a pediatric asthma expert because her case was too complex for her pediatrician, which is not unheard of. And we frequently see families and I'll just add this, we frequently see families when I do a history for a child with severe asthma, I talk to the parents and, discover they probably had some pretty uncontrolled asthma and as a child, but had never been formally diagnosed. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about air pollution in the pediatric context. And what's really important to know is that air pollution is really a significant problem in the pediatric world, and it doesn't really get a lot of press. The American Academy of Pediatrics, which is generally the Academy for Pediatricians, put out a statement on ambient air pollution and health hazards first in 2004, and they were one of the first large organizations to put out a policy statement, and then reaffirmed that policy statement in, I believe, 2021 or 2022. And this is that reaffirmed policy statement about ambient air pollution and health hazards. And what's really important to know is that children are not little adults. They are at increased risk of exposure, particularly to air pollution, but to all types of pollution. Their lung to body ratio is a little bit bigger. They breathe much faster. And they're also more prone to heat and problems with heat because, as you know, their tiny little bodies have this increased circulation that puts them at increased risk of heat-related illness. And then also, kids don't self-regulate, right? Kids play and play and play and play and play until they're absolutely exhausted. So a child with respiratory problems will play until they're coughing and coughing and coughing and coughing, maybe stop for a minute and keep going. And so sometimes it's really challenging to pick up those subtle signs when they continue to play and do all of those things, despite having symptoms. To them, their symptoms are really mild and inconsequential because it's impairing their ability, because they just want to play, right? And so they don't want to stop to be able to do that. And remember, they're also they're not really able to protect themselves like we are, to sit down, take a drink of water, to go in the shade for a period of time. And to take the adequate amount of rest that's needed to really recover. Next slide. And so the physiologic differences, we can see that ambient air pollution is linked to lower birth weight, to neurodevelopmental disorders, to pediatric cancers, and increased adult chronic conditions, including COPD. The mediators include oxidative stress and chronic inflammation. Endocrine disruption is really, really important. And there's these epigenetic and genetic mechanisms. And so you'll often see, we'll talk a little bit about environmental justice later in our talk, but these epigenetic and genetic mechanisms kind of interplay in the setting of air pollution that can definitely make vulnerable populations even more vulnerable to the health effects of air pollution. And as I said before, children have higher doses of air pollution. They breathe faster. They have greater air intake per kilogram of body weight compared to adults. And so children are definitely more prone to the effects of air pollution. And then they spend more time outside. We all want our kids to be outside. We all want our kids to run and play. But there are some consequences for that. Next slide. And so we'll talk a little bit about ozone. So there's the high level ozone that helps protect us from harmful UV radiation. But then there's this ground level ozone, and that ground level ozone is these nitrous oxides and volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, that combine with sunlight to produce this toxic ozone. And I live in Dallas. I'm at UT Southwestern, and we are in non-attainment for the EPA for ozone, and we are just about frequently because we get so much sunlight, and there's so much heat, and there's so many heat islands, so lots of concrete and things like that make things much hotter. But there's definitely data that shows that increased exposure to ozone can give you significant respiratory illness and respiratory effects, with increased incidence of asthma exacerbations, hospitalizations. You can also have increased incidence of respiratory tract infections and pneumonias in the pediatric population as well, with increased exposure to ozone. Next slide. The short-term exposure, there's increased risk of the emergency department visits and hospitalizations, mostly due to respiratory issues. There was actually a summer camp study, which I thought was very ingenious, because kids are at summer camp and they're outside and they're running and playing. And they did lung function in these children, and they showed that they had a reduction in their lung function with short-term exposure to ozone. And then ozone, 33 to 42 parts per billion are considered to be harmful to human health, and we're oftentimes above that. Next slide. Okay.
Oh, great, thank you. So for those of you who might have joined us, I'll just take this second to say that we're doing this presentation as a case presentation, and we are a volunteer from PSR Texas has offered us her story, so we're using that story to talk about important topics. We just covered childhood, and now we're going to move on to adulthood, which I'm going to present for you. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box. We're also eliciting feedback about what has your experience been. For example, up until now, perhaps you want to share some of your childhood experiences. And then we're going to go into adulthood right now. So please go ahead and use the chat box. It's being moderated, and we will definitely incorporate your questions and comments into the discussion. Okay, so all right, so I'm going back to the voice of our volunteer. From 1997 to 1999, I lived in the Texas Panhandle, neither the regular use of pesticides. Again, for those of you who missed, we moved from California, and now we're in Texas, right? And it's and I myself am in Philadelphia, but I understand that many of you are in Texas, and so we're going to focus on Texas right now. In 2011, I moved to a home in north central Austin, about 2 blocks away from Mopac, which I understand is a 4-lane highway. So, and then in my 40s, I began having similar coughing fits to my childhood. I've been on an inhaler since then, and have also had a preventive inhaler that I only use when I have a recurrent cough. My asthma attacks are infrequent. I usually have one incident per year when I need to regularly use the preventative inhaler and get a prescription for codeine-based cough suppressant to sleep for a couple of nights while the respiratory infection passes. And the point about that is that that's, strong cough suppressant. Okay, so if you can, we'll give you about maybe 30 seconds to put some thoughts about what are some of the issues that we've raised with this part of our case, and then we'll go on. And then, and Dr. Afolabi, perhaps you can maybe just kind of tell me when to move on.
So it looks like there's nothing in the chat yet.
Okay.
But
right.
But I will note that this is similar to what I see in clinic, as I said before, very, very frequently. You're taking care of a child, and then you discover that perhaps their adult parent needs to have some intervention as well.
Right, exactly. Okay, so I will tell you that there are many, many air pollutants. However, for the purpose of this talk, we're going to focus on some of the categories that the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, regulates under the Clean Air Act. One of them you've already heard about, that's ozone. The category of air pollutants that is regulated under EPA is sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, ozone that you heard about, particulate matter, lead, and carbon monoxide. We're not going to talk about all of those. We're going to focus on two of them. And again, the ozone you heard, and we're going to go on to talk about particulate matter next. The reason we're focusing on these two for the purpose of this presentation is that it's possible that you have heard about something called the Air Quality Index. The Air Quality Index is a tool that forecasts high pollution days, and what it measures is some of the most common air pollutants. That's ozone or particulate matter 2.5 or PM 2.5 and then PM 10. We're going to see later what the 2.5 and the 10 refer to. And then we're also going to talk about the color-coded scale of the air quality index. And in fact, we're going to end about, this is going to be an exercise for you, so be ready. We're going to ask you to tell us the AQI of where you are. Okay. So the reason that they're called particulates is because that's exactly what they are. They're solid particles that are composed of a whole bunch of different things. And the number refers to the size of that particle. And the reason it matters is because if you look at the lung anatomy, you'll see that you start with, a larger airway, which is the trachea, and then go to the bronchi, and then the bronchioles, and then end with, the alveolar air sacs. And so depending on the size of the particle, that can land at any point throughout the airway. But obviously the larger ones are caught further up, and the smaller ones make their way further and further into the respiratory system. And so you can see how the ultrafine particles are going to go all the way through the air sacs, and in fact, some of them are going to cross the blood barrier into the capillaries, and therefore become and travel throughout the rest of the body. And this is a very important mechanism because it's going to explain how air pollution doesn't just impact the pulmonary system, but in fact, it can impact other parts of your organ systems as well. Okay. So we said we're going to focus on Texas. This is a report that was done in January 2023 by Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ, and it shows all the counties that are in non-attainment. Non-attainment means that the ozone and the particulate matter in these counties are above what they should be, that is what's considered healthy. Can you folks who are living in Texas identify the counties that they're in and tell me whether they're in attainment or non-attainment? We just heard from Dr. Afolabi that Texas is in non-attainment. So that's, I'm not going to test my Texas geography, but that's right around here. So maybe you can tell us whether if there are any counties that you're living in.
I'm going to speak up. I just noticed that, it's not just Travis County is where Austin is. So that's in blue, but it's not just the two biggest counties in that region that aren't in attainment, right? It's all of the major neighboring counties, right, that have meaningful populations. And we refer to that area as the I-35 corridor. It goes from Laredo to Chicago. And it goes through Dallas also, which is in fabulous orange.
Yes, exactly. So thank you for saying that, Becky, because one of the things that we have focused, at least here in Pennsylvania, but that's true everywhere, is the fact that air pollution doesn't stop at a county line, right? It's not as if it's like, oh, the county's changing here, then we're not going to, pass it. No, that a lot, in fact, of the policies around air pollution are driven simply by this lack of border about air pollutants. Very, very good point. Oh yeah, I know what I wanted to say. Okay. All right, so I'm going to keep going here if nobody else has anything to say. Okay, so now I'm going to focus on the connection between climate change and air pollution. Now, I want to make sure that this is, because it's a very, very important topic. As the Earth warms and as it heats up, the amount of air pollution is going to get higher, and vice versa. Air pollution contributes to climate change. How does this happen? Well, one of the main reasons is that the greenhouse gases are what driving climate change, and it turns out that among the 6 criteria air pollutants, those the ones that I had named for you as regulated by EPA, 2 of them, which is ground level ozone and nitrogen dioxide, also act as greenhouse gases. So in fact, air pollutants make climate change happen. And then on the flip side, climate change increases air pollution. How? You've actually already heard Dr. Afolabi talk about it. She just told you that ground level ozone is a photochemical reaction, that under the presence of the sun, the chemical reaction of the VOCs and the nitrous oxides combine to make ozone. And so the more heat you have, then the more ozone you have. So there's this kind of a reciprocal reaction, a synergistic reaction that happens. Most importantly, both greenhouse gases and air pollutants are released by the same processes. And Becky just named one, the mobile sources of air pollution, the highways, and vehicle use, for example. Stationary sources are also very, very important. Those are the power plants and such. And so both of them, both of those 2 categories of sources release air pollutants and greenhouse gases. So that is how climate change and air pollution are connected. And then there's also once you get past the mechanism, the reality is that the climate change results in air pollution, for example, in the form of wildfires. And we're going to talk a little bit about wildfires right now, but in other ways too, like heat waves and extreme precipitation. So here's kind of a graph that shows how there is this kind of like a feedback loop between air pollution and climate change, that one makes the other worse. And then here we're seeing about what's in your air. Essentially, you can't really, kind of separate it, right? The body sees all of it. You have, on both of those 2 things, climate change and air pollution contribute to ill health. They impact human health. And so this is also a nice graph, that goes into that connection. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Afolabi to talk about wildfires in children.
So we talked a little bit about how our volunteer was exposed to wildfires, and wildfires have a significant impact on children. So we talked about this before. They spend more time outdoors, they breathe faster, and take more air in relative to their body weight. They have these developing lungs that are not fragile, to be quite honest, but still growing, and more susceptible to delays in lung growth when exposed to air pollution. And their nasal passages filter less air pollution. They have few of those little cilia, those little hairs that filter out some air pollution. And in addition to that, wildfire smoke PM is far more toxic than other pollutants from other. Okay, am I unmuted? Sorry, I don't know when that happened. Remember, when you're dealing with wildfire smoke, you're not burning. You're burning material, you're putting soot into the air, and then sometimes you're burning homes, right? And so those homes, unfortunately, burning homes can have lots of toxic material that's being burned. And then wildfire smoke events can last for weeks to months, and then their spread is extremely, extremely far. As we remember with the wildfire, well, if you're from the East Coast, with the wildfire smoke in Canada, on the East Coast, that went into New York, and New York had never experienced anything like that. The West Coast frequently experiences of the United States frequently experiences the ramifications of wildfire smoke from Canada. Not infrequent, almost every single year. And Canada does have a significant wildfires. And then even in Texas, we recently had a very large wildfire, and that the ramifications of that wildfire were extensive. But also the spread was extensive, and it was in an area of West Texas that has the highest prevalence of asthma, and so, but a very low prevalence of pediatric providers, and so that was a big issue for those children and for those folks that were exposed to wildfire smoke during that time. So wildfires, though they're natural, can have and continue to have significant implications and issues in the pediatric and adult population. Next slide.
So actually, I'm glad you mentioned the Canadian wildfires, Dr. Afolabi, because that is exactly the point that we're trying to make here about the fact that that wildfires are not just hazardous for their surrounding areas, but they can travel for miles and miles and degrade the air quality many distances away. And so this is a map of the Canadian, the air pollutants from the Canadian wildfires. What's funny is that, Philadelphia is right below New York City. And so on that Wednesday after, when New York City experiences worse air quality, Philadelphia experiences worse air quality. And on that day, Philadelphia had a worse air quality than New Delhi did on that day. And what was interesting is that, I was checking, for example, Montreal's air quality, perfect. It was perfect. And so, and yet, here we were, breathing in supremely toxic air. So the way that, air pollution travels, it's, in my mind, is very, very hard to predict. And so that's what makes it a very, very a collective issue. Let's see, what else did I want to say about this? I think that's pretty much it. Okay, so going back to our case presentation, in May 2022, our volunteer had a minor heart attack, and she spent the night at the Austin Heart Hospital. Angiogram showed a 40% blockage in a couple of arteries. It turns out that there is a family history of heart disease, high blood pressure, and high cholesterol. And so as she started working on improving cardiac health, eating healthy, in the fall of 2023, the blood pressure had become so uncontrolled that at this time they are now taking 5 heart medications daily to keep everything in check. So does this bring up any issues that you think you want to ask about or mention?
So it does specifically for me. I know, I'm pediatric pulmonary, and so I know there's significant cardiac effects of air pollution, and the American Heart Association has really emphasized that. Not just, they're worried about smoking, but they're also worried about air pollution as well. Is there, my question is there a lot of education regarding those things in the adult population?
So glad you asked that, because that's exactly what we're doing now. That exactly is my point. It is that, like I was explaining with particulates before, most folks associate air pollution with pulmonary issues. In the next several slides, I'm going to harp on the fact that, in fact, the cardiovascular issues associated with air pollution are actually in some ways even more prevalent and perhaps more important. And the reason I say that is because cardiac illnesses in and of themselves are the #1 cause of mortality and morbidity in the United States. Actually, I said workers, but also non-workers as well, everyone. And if that's the #1 cause, and air pollution has such a significant impact on cardiac illnesses, then that makes the cardiac illnesses one of the highest prevalent conditions caused by air pollution. And so again, we go back to kind of, our two air pollutants that we've been focusing on, ozone and PM2.5. And you can see that, the number of ischemic heart disease and stroke are like the top 2 conditions impacted by these 2 air pollutants. And in fact, they've done studies on this on cities. There's some, very seminal studies that have shown that the impact of air pollution on things like, for example, your carotid arteries, which then lead to stroke. And so look, PM2, actually, I think I should say PM2.5. Stroke is the number 2 condition that's listed under there. So that's exactly, yes. So, so the answer is that I don't think there can be enough education about this because it is so important. Let me see what else do I want to say. Oh yeah, so some of the cardiovascular effects are that there's changes in the vascular tone, there's changes in blood pressure, as we saw in the case, that a lot of air pollutants cause inflammatory reactions. There's the autonomic function. Heart just kind of, has its, there's a lot of autonomic function that's associated with the heart. And there's an altered function with that. There is some that's local, right? Heart and lung are next to each other, and systemic, as we said. Remember, some of these air pollutants travel to many places in the body. For example, liver is impacted, brain's impacted, and then there is accelerated atherosclerosis because of the inflammation and oxidative stress. So any questions or comments about that? I'm so glad you asked that, Dr. Afalabi, because I was exactly.
There's nothing in the.
There's nothing.
Yeah, I might have remembered. Yeah, there's nothing in the chat right now.
Okay, all right, no problem. All right, so.
Somebody did. I'm sorry, somebody did raise their hand.
Oh, okay.
Can you come off mute?
Yes, I can. Hi, good evening. This is Adelita Cantu. I'm the chair of the Texas PSR. I have a question, but you may get to it later, and so my question may be too early. Are you going to, it's cancer in one of your slides, you're talking about lung cancer. I noticed that the slide before, it showed the lung cancer as a consequence of this. I think it was in your slide before this.
Yeah, so let me go, maybe this one? Yes, right here.
Yes, yeah.
I can speak in general terms about it. Did you have a specific question about it?
Well, my sister was just diagnosed with lung cancer. No history of smoking. Her spouse, no history of smoking. She's been retired for a while. Seemingly no risk factors other than her, environmental issues. So I just was wanting to, when I saw that data point there, was wondering if you had any more to say about lung cancer.
Yeah, no, sure. We don't, but I'm happy to speak about it. And the part of the reason was, again, the focus was on things that maybe people might not associate with air pollution, like cardiac illness. However, the point that you raise is extremely important. And to be honest with you, there's so much to say about air pollution. So what I will say is this. I don't know if folks are familiar with IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer. They have and the goal of this agency, the aim of this agency is to identify carcinogens. They scour literature and then they categorize compounds and chemicals based on what's called their carcinogenicity. And so they have labeled air pollutants, they don't even say which one, as a type 1 carcinogen. And in fact, and the reason for that is because of the lung cancer, and if I'm not mistaken, also bladder cancer, but don't quote me on that one. I know I'm being recorded, so don't quote me on that one, but definitely lung cancer. So yes, so air pollution is an identified carcinogen by the agency, that identifies carcinogens. Now, there's a lot more to say about that. You might say, well, which ones? And as far as they're concerned, it almost doesn't matter, because air pollutants travel together, and we talked a little bit about that. We said that the same sources that release greenhouse gases also do air pollutants, and so and the air pollutants that are released by one source, there's many different kinds of them. One particular kind is polyaromatic hydrocarbons, for example, or PAHs. They are a result of an incomplete combustion. And if you can think about it, right, combustion happens so often in our lives, namely vehicles. So for example, that would be one particular a category of air pollutants that would be directly linked to lung cancer. However, it's not the only one, and again, it's the entire category altogether. What I might say about your sister is that I'm not sure how old she is, but there is a specific kind of lung cancer that is unrelated to smoking. Often smokers get what's called squamous cell carcinoma of the lung. This bronchiogenic lung cancer is a different category that is unrelated to smoking, and it often happens in women in, for example, their 50s, maybe 60s. And in my mind, I think that there is a very significant environmental component to that. There's other air pollutants that we haven't touched upon at all. In fact, again, that could be its own whole thing, like, for example, pesticides and things like that. I know that I'm not doing truly justice in exploring, this right now on the spot, but I hope that at least answers some of the points that you'd hope to raise.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate the resources you cited.
Okay, great. All right.
So
yeah.
There's a question in the chat, and it is there an index that integrates not only air pollutants, but also heat index to help guide when to curtail routines? And so I know that's coming up, but I don't remember when.
It's at the end. I just thought of curiosity. I don't know who this person is, but this person might have known exactly, what we're going to talk about. Just for everybody's information, I can't see the chat. That's why Dr. Afolabi is helping me out. But yes, that person definitely knows how we're going to, or definitely can guess, how we're going to end this webinar. But we're coming to that very shortly. Okay, so let's see, we have maybe about 3 more topics before we get to that particular topic, but we will get to it. One of the other topics that we didn't talk about today are allergens, which are kind of I would say, their own entire category as far as things that are suspended in the air, but also things that impact asthma and allergies, and also related to climate change. As precipitation and sea level rise lead to increased flooding, many homes have problems with mold. Many workers who respond to disasters are going to have to address the mold that's in areas that they're going to be working. And then on the other side, the pollen count has been increasing every allergy season, mainly for several reasons. Number one, as we know, hot seasons are definitely expanding in terms of temporally and spatially, right? The length of these seasons is increasing, but the geography of these seasons is also increasing. The other thing that's interesting is that carbon dioxide apparently increases the allergenicity of these, pollen compounds. So or actually, I'm sorry, carbon dioxide increases the allergenicity of these carbon compounds. So a lot more to say about that, but we'll just leave that there for now. And then another super important topic is indoor air quality. 90% of indoor air quality is impacted by outdoor air quality. So if you have problematic outdoor air quality, you will have problematic indoor air quality. In addition to the fact that there's a whole bunch of indoor specific sources, one of them which PSR does work on, which are gas stoves. So again, won't say too much about that either, but just so you know that it's important to talk about them. All right, Dr. Afolabi.
So I misplaced my notes for this, but what I wanted to really emphasize is that there has been this history of redlining. And so what redlining is these specific areas within cities that governmental agencies, not intentionally, but essentially made difficult for folks to get homeowners, not homeowners insurance, but to get home loans. And so during the Great Depression, people were challenged to get home loans, and they wanted to infuse the economy they wanted to improve the economy and infuse the economy with more money by allowing folks to buy homes. And so they put out a special, and I don't have my notes for the name of it, a program to give money to private lenders and government lenders to lend out money for home loans. And so they were like, what are the different risk categories for these different loans? Well, they did risk categories for loans according to according to location. And there's locations that were historically that were minoritized, so were mostly Black and Hispanic, or mostly Black folks in those areas. They made those areas uninsurable, and they were specifically redlined. They made circles around those areas where they were not, where home loans were unable to be obtained. And so those areas, and so this was this was during the Great Depression in the 1930s, but it continued until like the 60s or 70s, where the Fair Housing Act came, and that improved the ability to put those loans. But if you look at the legacy of redlining, those areas that were historically redlined continue to have issues with air pollution and the manifestations of air pollution that are outside to their neighboring areas. And so in Austin, Elizabeth Matsui and Sarah Chambliss looked at the role of neighborhood air pollution and disparate racial and ethnic asthma acute care use. And so they found in these areas that more Black folks were coming to the ER for asthma exacerbations in these specific areas, and even in some of the surrounding areas. But the proportion of those folks that were historically minoritized were more frequently seen in the emergency room. And then Jackie in Practice, so the Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology, put out a statement. Sorry, can you go back really quickly?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, sorry, I wasn't sure if that's the next slide or not, but yes,
no,
go ahead.
Yeah, put out a statement redlining to talking about redlining in hotspots and the impact of continued legacy of structural and institutional racism and bias in children and asthma. So this is really becoming very this is becoming more and more recognized and more important. And so if you go to the next slide, then you can see the correlation. So this is Dallas, right? And if you look at the picture on the left, it's a map of areas that were historically redlined in Dallas in the 1930s. And those areas that are in red and yellow are the areas that were more predominantly impoverished. In the map, it's not a exactly equivalent map, but where you see the blue dot is kind of the center of the city. And then the picture on the left, you can see Dallas kind of lightly right in the middle, looks at the pediatric asthma vulnerability scale within Dallas, and it looks at a bunch of different things. But you can see in that pediatric vulnerability scale, those areas that were historically redlined are also those areas that now have the highest vulnerability and prevalence of asthma. So that very dark blue area are the areas that are where the areas of where asthma is your most vulnerable and most prevalent. And so Dallas is still seeing the historic practice of redlining manifesting in asthma. And I will tell you, it's not just asthma. There aren't other vulnerability scales, and this is from the Dallas County Health Department. There's data that shows that there's increased risk of cardiovascular disease in these particular areas, increased incidence of cancers in these particular areas. And so these are historically redlined areas where there's increased risk of lots of many different things. And one of the biggest challenges, we're talking specifically about air pollution, is that our ability to monitor air pollution in these particular areas is very hampered. The EPA monitors that are the regulatory monitors that look at air pollution, very few of them are actually in these specific areas. So it's a little challenging to make a direct correlate between air pollution and the historic air redlining. But what I will say is that the city of Dallas is putting out new non-regulatory air monitors, and you can definitely tell that there's a difference in that area versus some of these other areas. In terms of they all look at different things, but there's definitely a difference in what the pollution levels look like. Now, it's not apples to apples, but it's not apples to oranges when you look at these different regulatory monitors. And so the effects of redlining and the effects of and air pollution together, you can make that story pretty cohesively looking at these maps. Next slide.
Yeah, and I'll talk about this one. This study also is kind of an extension of some of the topics that we're talking about, which is where, as we know, the concept of environmental justice is in access to the same environmental conditions, regardless of your race or socioeconomic background. And so, in this study, what they did is they looked at whether the difference between non-white people and white people living in the various states in the United States, and in terms of their air pollution burden, in terms of how much are they exposed to particulate matter 2.5 in this case, and so and here they've mapped out where non-white people face higher exposure to particulate matter air pollution than white people do, and essentially everywhere they do except 4 states. So in all other states, there's a high air pollution burden. And then in Washington, D.C., people of color living in Indiana and Alabama are exposed to roughly twice as much particulate pollution as white people. So, and I believe that this was controlled for socioeconomic status. So. An important study about showing the greater burden of air pollution. Okay, anything else that you want to say about that, Dr. Afolabi, or should we move on?
No, well, I just wanted to reemphasize the fact that sometimes, proving this case can be a little bit challenging because the data doesn't always exist in those neighborhoods, right? And so you really do, and so that's part of what environmental justice is actually gathering that data to make those compelling arguments for these vulnerable populations. And then it's also important to know that this isn't just a problem of Black and Hispanic folks, because, as we talked about with wildfires, these things perpetuate themselves and spread kind of widely, right? So those surrounding areas you saw were affected as well. And so, and these are areas that are growing and developing in many different ways. And so making sure that these areas are getting the attention that they need, getting the help that they need, and getting the pollution mitigation strategies that are important, that are helpful, are really important. And one important way to do that is through your city councilmen and zoning, and really making zoning equitable so that there are not so many high pollutant manufacturers kind of in those areas, and making sure that the like things like parks and trails and things like that get the trees there equitably to those particular areas as well.
And so to that point, what we want everybody to do is I'm talk a little bit about the air quality index. There's actually several important points about this slide. The air quality index, as we pointed out before, it's a tool that predicts air pollutants. It will tell you which one it's giving you the measurement for. For example, this one is PM 2.5. Generally, anything higher than 100, that's this orange one, is considered to be unhealthy. However, even in the yellow area, some people who are vulnerable, it might be unhealthy for them as well. And it's not as if, you know, at like 51, there is this shift. There is a gradation. So of course, like 40 is better than 50 and 30 is better than both of them. So the lower you have that, the better it is. And I'll just kind of like give you the day that I was saying that the Canadian wildfires had reached Philadelphia last June. You can see down there, 500 is the worst. In Philadelphia was like 463. So really bad. And to Dr. Afolabi's point, one of the important things is that, so one of the apps, so there's a couple of tools that you can go to, websites you can go to. One is called Air Now. The one that I use is Air Visual. And so if you all can maybe go in and tell us the air quality of where you are at right now. You can also give an air quality of somewhere you want to be. I don't know, Hawaii somewhere, let's say. Or somewhere you just want to compare it to, New Delhi, let's say, and then put it in the chat box. And the important issue here is that some of these apps, Air Visual in particular, they also show the measurement done by personal air monitors of citizens. And so it's a citizen science, it's a collective information gathering by citizens. It also shows that, and that adds a lot of information and also very hyper local information. As we saw, there's unpredictability sometimes in the way that air pollution travels. And so what this does is that it gives hyperlocal information about these areas. And speaking to the point that was raised about advocacy for cleaner air, there's a measure in Louisiana where they're going to limit the policies based on these citizen science data. And so that's the kind of thing that we can't let happen, because yes, it's like the EPA has very few air monitors, that and maybe some of them are not placed in areas, where that gather important information about the most vulnerable populations. And so this type of citizen science data definitely significantly contributes to the collective information that can be gathered. And then I also have included the heat index map here. Please also tell us what is the heat index of where you are. And notice that I'm saying heat index and not temperature. The reason is that temperature is not the only thing that impacts how body feels heat. Humidity, for example, is a significant factor. And furthermore, to the question that was raised in the chat box, there is an interplay between air pollution and heat. And so, for example, for that child that's playing outside, It's the heat, it's the humidity, as well as the various air pollutants, that we've mentioned. So the cumulative impact of all of these make a big difference. So I don't know if anybody's put what their AQI is
They
in the
have
chat.
put what their AQI is in
Okay.
the chat. So it looks like Austin is 74 and San Antonio is 84. I'm in San Diego right now and mine is 41.
Okay. Okay. Oh, interesting. So wow, Austin is so those are oh, and you guys are, yeah, I see. And then let me see, I'll tell you what Philadelphia is. Philadelphia is 56. Okay.
And I think it's a matter of the temperature. It's in the 90s in Austin and San Antonio, and it's kind of closer to the 70s here. And I don't know what temperature it is in Philly.
And I'll tell you what is right. And so most of your the weather apps, it's 73. And I'll tell you what the feel like temperature is. So the feel like temperature is kind of as close as what weather apps come to telling us. It's 69, the feel temperature, incorporating a lot of other things. And of course, like right now, it's, nighttime here. We're kind of like the latest amongst all the time zones that are present on the webinar today. So you don't have the rest of the factors. For example, the refraction from the sun, for example, we don't have that. But there are some other, things like, wind, wind speed and wind gust and all those other things. And not to get too technical about it, but all of those make a difference. Okay, and that's our last slide.
Yeah.
Anything else, Dr. Afolabi, or anything from the chat box?
There's a lot in the chat talking about New Delhi shows 188 PM for AQI, and lucky you in Philly, it's 89, and Austin and feels like 95. And so a lot of interaction in the chat. And so I just wanted to say thank you all for participating and for coming here and listening. And I learned something from Dr. Sabiri as well. And so I was very, I thought this was great. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great partnering up with you and great partnering up with UT Health Houston and PSR Texas. I will go ahead and stop sharing if I can figure out how to do it.
I don't know if there's any additional questions in the chat for anything, if anyone wants to ask about anything specifically.
Also, is
Go
there
ahead.
a way for folks to reach you if they think of something later and would like to consult or ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely. It depends on how you want to do it. Becky, would you like them to contact you and then you can, put us in touch? That's perfectly fine.
That would be fine.
And then I'm happy to go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that I'm not sure everybody would even have our email address, but if they email, information or info on our website, it will get to me eventually.
I'm happy to put my email in the chat.
Oh yeah, that works too. I can do that too.
Oh yeah, you can see the chat now.
Yes, I stopped sharing. Yeah, there you go. Okay. All right, so if there's nothing else, then we'll adjourn this webinar. Thank you all for joining and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
both.